I was standing in my living room when my house stopped feeling like mine. Instead, he said she would be staying here as family, and for the first time since the night before, the silence did not feel quite so heavy. I started noticing the changes on the third day, not because they were dramatic, but because they were deliberate. Emily woke before I did. I could tell because the kitchen no longer smelled like quiet when I came downstairs. Cabinets were open. The coffee maker had been reprogrammed. My usual mug was in the drying rack instead of on its hook. These were not accidents. They were decisions made by someone who assumed she would not be corrected. She greeted me brightly, as if we were old friends sharing space by mutual agreement. She said she hoped I did not mind that she had reorganized a few things to make mornings easier. She said she liked efficiency. She said it helped her feel settled in my house. I nodded and poured myself coffee without answering. I did not want to hear the justification. Justifications were how people excused crossing lines they knew existed. By the end of that week, she had established routines. Her shoes lined up by the door, her toiletries in the main bathroom, her groceries mixed into mine. Richard said nothing. He moved around her comfortably, stepping aside when she passed. Answering her questions about trash pickup and internet passwords like this was all perfectly normal. Susan came by one afternoon with a pie and a tight smile. She hugged Emily first. She told her how brave she was, how change was never easy, how families had to support each other through transitions. I waited for Susan to look at me, to acknowledge that I was also standing there. She did eventually, but her eyes slid past me quickly, as if lingering might invite a conversation she did not want to have. Over tea. Susan said this arrangement was temporary in spirit, even if it took time to work out in practice. She said peace was more important than principle. She said at our age, conflict only led to loneliness. I understood the message. Do not make trouble. Do not assert yourself. Do not risk being labeled difficult. The air changed instantly. Even the house seemed to react. The old floor gave a long creak as if it were protesting. I felt every eye turn toward me, waiting, watching, measuring how long it would take before I reacted. Emily listened politely, hands wrapped around her cup, nodding at all the right moments. When Susan left, Emily thanked me for being so understanding. She said she admired my strength. I wondered what kind of strength she meant, the kind that endured quietly or the kind that stepped aside gracefully. The next Saturday, I came home from the grocery store to find Emily and Richard sitting on the couch together, legs angled toward each other, laughing softly. The throw blanket I usually kept folded was draped across their knees. My blanket. Emily looked up and said she hoped I did not mind that she had invited a friend over later. She said it would be nice to socialize. She said it might help normalize things. Normalize? I asked her who was coming. She said a couple from work. She said they were curious about the neighborhood. She said she had already told them to park on the street. I looked at Richard. He avoided my eyes. I told her we usually discussed guests ahead of time. She blinked, surprised. Then she smiled and said, of course. She just assumed it would be fine. She said family did not need permission. Emily smiled then. A polite smile, almost apologetic, but not enough to step back, not enough to refuse what was being offered. That word again. That evening, two strangers sat at my dining table eating from plates I had chosen, commenting on the charm of the house and the warmth of the neighborhood. Emily told them stories about the area, about the renovations, about the way the light hit the living room in the afternoon. She spoke with confidence, as if these memories belonged to her. At one point, she referred to the house as our place. No one corrected her. I felt something tighten in my chest then. Not pain exactly, but pressure. The pressure of being erased slowly, politely, with smiles and small talk. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen alone. Emily offered to help, but I declined. I needed the motion, the familiarity of it. Richard went upstairs without saying much. Tired from the evening, he said, later that night, lying awake in bed, I realized that if I did nothing, this would continue. Each day, another inch surrendered, another assumption made permanent through repetition. This was not chaos, it was strategy. Emily was not loud or aggressive. She did not demand. She inserted herself gently, steadily, until resistance felt impolite, until correction felt petty, until silence felt easier. I had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. I had used it myself once or twice, back when I still believed that being agreeable was the same thing as being kind. She bent down, lifted her suitcase, and rolled it across my floor. Sunday morning brought another shift. Emily rearranged the bookshelf, said she thought it would look nicer by color. She placed a framed photo of herself and Richard on the end table by the sofa. A recent photo, one I had never seen before. I picked it up and turned it face down without comment. She noticed, of course she did. She said she did not mean anything by it. She said she just wanted the space to feel welcoming. She said she hoped I was not uncomfortable. I told her I was adjusting. That afternoon, Susan called. She said Richard was under a lot of stress. She said I should try to be supportive instead of territorial. She said the house belonged to the family, not to one person. I asked her who she thought the family was. She hesitated, then said everyone who needed it. That was when I understood how alone I was in this. Richard came home early that evening and asked if everything was okay. His voice held a warning beneath the concern. He wanted calm. He wanted cooperation. He wanted this to be easy. The sound of the wheels echoed louder than it should have. It felt invasive, like hearing footsteps in your bedroom in the middle of the night. I told him I was feeling displaced. He frowned, as if the word surprised him. He said no one was trying to push me out. He said I was reading too much into things. He said Emily was just settling in. Settling in, again. I asked him how long he expected her to stay. He said we would figure it out. I asked him what family meant to him. He said it meant showing up for people. I asked him if showing up for me counted. He did not answer right away. That silence told me more than any argument could have. She moved straight toward the armchair by the fireplace. My chair, the one I sat in every night with a book and a cup of tea. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to make it look respectful, then lowered herself into it and crossed her legs. Later, as I lay in bed listening to footsteps in the hallway, I thought about how quickly a place could turn unfamiliar, how easily history could be overwritten if no one defended it. This house had not changed, but the rules had, and the longer I waited, the more those rules would solidify around me, leaving less and less room to stand. I stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks I had memorized years ago, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not acceptance, awareness. If Emily believed she belonged here, it was because someone had given her that confidence. And if Richard believed he could decide that on his own, it was because he assumed I would not challenge him. That assumption was about to become very uncomfortable for everyone involved. Down the hall, a door closed softly, and I knew I had reached the point where watching quietly was no longer enough. I did not confront anyone the next morning. I made breakfast the way I always had and waited until the house emptied. Richard left for work a little after 8. Emily followed him out a few minutes later, cheerful, carrying a tote bag and talking about errands. When the front door closed behind them, the house settled into a silence that felt cautious, as if it knew I was about to do something important. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, then turned toward the small office near the back of the house. The one room that had remained untouched because no one else had ever had much interest in it. That was the moment I understood. That was where the paperwork lived. I had always been organized, not obsessively, but deliberately. Decades of consulting work had taught me that documents mattered, even when people told you they did not, especially then. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the folder labeled Property. Inside were copies of the closing documents from 2008, renovation contracts, insurance papers, tax records. I spread them across the desk and began reading slowly, carefully, as if I were looking for a detail I had somehow missed the first time around. Back then, I had trusted the process, trusted Richard, trusted that marriage meant shared ground. Now I read with different eyes. The deed was there, just as I remembered. But the wording felt colder than it had years ago. The house was held in a family trust. Richard was listed as the primary trustee. That part I knew. What I had not focused on was how much authority that role carried and how little it required from me to be overlooked. I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightening with each paragraph. There was a section outlining my right to reside in the home. A lifetime right, it said. That should have reassured me, but the language was precise, conditional. It depended on certain assumptions remaining intact. Marriage, use of the home as a shared residence, the absence of disputes that required intervention. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This was not as simple as I had believed. This was not a visit. This was not a favor. This was a claim. I kept reading. The trust allowed the trustee to make decisions in the best interest of the family. That phrase appeared again and again. Best interest, family, words that sounded warm until you realized how flexible they could be made. I imagined Richard sitting across from a lawyer, explaining that tensions in the house required adjustment, that Emily needed stability, that bringing her in was a temporary solution for the greater good. I imagined a judge or mediator reading the same language I was reading now and deciding that my discomfort was unfortunate but not decisive. The thought made my throat tighten. I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard we had landscaped ourselves. The maple tree, Richard insisted on planting too close to the fence. The stone path I had designed. The bench where I used to sit in the evenings and watch the light fade and think I was safe. For the first time since Emily arrived, fear rose fully into focus. Not fear of losing Richard. That grief had already settled into something dull and familiar. Fear of being told to leave, of being asked to pack up decades of living because someone else had decided I was inconvenient. No one spoke. Susan stared out the window as if something fascinating were happening in the yard. Michael shifted his weight and sighed. Richard watched me closely, his face carefully neutral, as if he were bracing for an outburst. I returned to the desk and kept going. There were amendments added years later. After my sister died, I remembered signing something then, distracted, trusting Richard when he said it was routine. I found the document now and read it line by line, my pulse quickening. The amendment clarified trustee authority in cases of conflict within the household. Conflict. The word stared back at me like a warning. I understood then how precarious my position could become if I moved too quickly or too loudly. If I framed this as emotional rather than legal, if I allowed anyone to describe me as unstable or unreasonable, I gathered the papers into neat stacks and slid them back into the folder. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow. I was not standing on solid ground, not yet. That afternoon, Susan called again. She asked how I was holding up. She said Richard had mentioned things felt tense. She said I should try not to escalate. I told her I was fine. They were all waiting for me to break. She said she hoped I understood this was temporary. I asked her what temporary meant. She said it meant until things settled. I asked her settled for whom. She sighed, impatient now, and said I was overthinking. She said at our age, flexibility mattered more than being right. I hung up without arguing. Later, Emily returned with shopping bags and a bright mood. She talked about the grocery store, about how convenient everything was, about how she loved the light in the house. She mentioned that she might bring over some of her furniture if she stayed longer. Nothing big, she said, just to make it feel more like home. More like home. I smiled politely and excused myself. Upstairs, in the bedroom that still smelled like my detergent and my routines. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the reality settle in. The room looked exactly the way it always had on Sunday afternoons. Soft light coming in through the wide front windows, dust floating lazily in the air, the old oak floor creaking when someone shifted their weight. The same sofa I had picked out 16 years ago after months of debating fabric swatches. The same armchair near the fireplace where I read every evening. Nothing had changed, and yet something had already broken. To cry, to yell, to demand an explanation, to ask how he could do this to me in my own home. If I made a mistake now, if I reacted without understanding the structure beneath me, I could lose more than dignity. I could lose access. I could lose leverage. I could lose the one place that had anchored me through every transition of my adult life. I thought of the women I had known over the years who had been quietly displaced, asked to move in with children, downsized into smaller spaces, told it was time to adjust. I had always believed that would not be me. I had believed paperwork protected me. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, my mind moving quickly now, sorting possibilities. I needed clarity, not reassurance, not comfort, facts. That evening, Richard asked if we could talk. He said he sensed I was pulling away. He said he wanted to understand how I was feeling. I told him I was trying to understand where I stood. He frowned, confused, and said, of course this was my home. I asked him what would happen if we disagreed about Emily staying. He hesitated. I could feel it rising in my chest, that familiar tightness, the sharp edge of disbelief pressing against the softer ache of humiliation. My first instinct was to speak, to defend my space, to remind everyone who I was. I asked him who had final authority over decisions like that. He said it was complicated. That was enough. After he left the room, I returned to the office and opened the folder again. I copied the documents, carefully, quietly. I placed the originals back exactly where they had been and slid the copies into my bag. I did not know yet what I would do with them. I only knew I could not afford to be uninformed. As the house grew quiet again, I sat at the desk and looked at the neat stacks of paper, each one representing a choice I had made years ago under different assumptions. The trust had been created to protect the family. The question now was whether it would protect me. I turned off the light and closed the door softly behind me, aware that from this point forward, every step would need to be measured. But instinct had never served women like me very well. The margin for error had just become very small. The pressure did not come all at once. It arrived in pieces, carried by familiar voices using careful language. Susan came over on Tuesday afternoon without calling first. I heard her car in the driveway and felt my shoulders tense before I even saw her. She let herself in the way she always had, keys jangling, voice already filling the hallway as if presence alone gave her permission. She brought pastries from the bakery near her house and set them on the counter. She asked how I was doing. She said she knew this was difficult for everyone. She said Richard was under a lot of stress and that I could help by keeping things calm. Calm was the word people reached for when they wanted silence. We sat at the kitchen table, where I had hosted countless meals over the years. Susan folded her hands neatly and leaned forward. She told me that families survive by being flexible. She told me that holding on too tightly only made things worse. She told me that Emily was young and vulnerable and needed support. I waited for her to say my name in that context, to acknowledge that I might also need something. Instead, she said sometimes the best thing a woman can do is step back and let things find their balance. I asked her what balance looked like to her. She paused, then said it looked like everyone getting along. It looked like compromise. It looked like not making a scene. I asked if compromise meant giving up my place in my own home. So I did the last thing they expected. She sighed and said I was taking things too personally. That was the first time I felt anger rise sharp and clear. Not loud, focused. I told her this was personal. I told her it could not be anything else. Susan stood and said she hoped I would think about what she had said. She kissed my cheek and left, her concern hanging in the air like a judgment. Later that evening, Michael called. My stepson rarely called me directly. We had always been polite, cordial, but distant in the way adult children sometimes are with second parents. He asked how things were going. He said he had heard there was tension. He said he hated to see everyone so uncomfortable. I asked him what he thought would make things more comfortable. He said maybe it was time to consider a fresh start. He said houses were just assets in the end. He said selling might simplify things for everyone. I asked him where he thought I would go. He hesitated, then said I was resourceful. He said I would land on my feet. I smiled. I ended the call shortly after that. By the end of the week, the message was clear. Peace was more important than my presence. Harmony mattered more than my history. Richard did not defend me. He did not contradict them. He listened. He nodded. He told me later that everyone just wanted what was best. Best for whom was never specified. Emily remained polite, always pleasant. She asked if I wanted help with dinner. She complimented the house. She thanked me for being understanding. Each word felt like a small push, gentle but persistent, moving me closer to the edge. One evening, she mentioned that Susan had invited her to lunch. She said Susan had been so kind, so welcoming. I smiled and said I was glad. Inside, something hardened. That night, Richard suggested we talk. He said he felt caught in the middle. He said he wished everyone could just be reasonable. I asked him what reasonable meant to him. Not a big smile, not warm, just enough to register, enough to signal that I was still standing. He said it meant not escalating. It meant not turning this into a legal or financial issue. It meant trusting that things would settle. I asked him if he trusted me. He said, of course. I asked him why that trust did not extend to my place in this house. He looked away. I realized then that what they were doing was not accidental. It was a slow narrowing, a quiet strategy. Make the environment uncomfortable, make the resistance seem unreasonable, frame the outcome as inevitable. I had seen this before, not in my own life, but in others. Women my age pushed into smaller spaces, asked to adapt, praised for their grace as they disappeared. I went to bed early that night and lay awake listening to the house. The sounds were familiar but no longer comforting. I felt like a guest waiting to be told when it was time to leave. The next morning I woke with a clarity that surprised me. Not resolve, not a plan, just an understanding. They were counting on me to choose peace over presence, to mistake quiet for dignity. I said, "Welcome home." I dressed carefully and left the house without telling anyone where I was going. I drove to a small park a few miles away and sat on a bench watching people walk their dogs, jog, live their ordinary lives. I thought about my age, 62, old enough to know better, young enough to fight if I had to. I thought about how many years I had invested in this family, how easily that investment was being dismissed as inconvenience. When I returned home, Richard was waiting. He asked where I had been. His tone was cautious, measuring. I told him I had been thinking. He said he hoped I was not planning anything drastic. I told him I was planning to protect myself. That caught his attention. He asked what I meant. I said I meant I would not agree to any arrangement that erased me. I said I would not leave quietly. I said if decisions were being made about my life and my home, I would be part of them. The words surprised even me. I watched them land in the room, watched Emily blink in confusion, watched Richard exhale slightly, as if he had just survived something dangerous. Susan turned her head then, eyes narrowing just a fraction, as if trying to decide whether she had misheard me. He said that sounded like a threat. I said it was a boundary. Emily came into the room then and stopped when she sensed the tension. She asked if everything was okay. Richard said we were just talking. I looked at her and saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not fear, calculation. That was when I understood she was not just a guest caught in the middle. She was a participant. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I returned to the office and pulled out the copies of the trust documents again. I read them with new focus, no longer looking for reassurance but for leverage. If this was going to be framed as family versus troublemaker, I needed something stronger than emotion. I needed facts that could not be softened by appeals to peace. I stacked the papers neatly and slid them back into my bag. Emily thanked me. She said she really appreciated it. She said she knew this was not easy. The family had made their position clear. Now it was my turn to decide how far I was willing to go to keep from being erased. I turned off the light and sat in the darkness for a long moment, aware that the next step would change everything, whether I wanted it to or not. I did not sleep much that night, but the lack of rest sharpened something in me instead of dulling it. By morning, I knew I could not do this alone, not because I was weak, but because this was no longer a private disagreement. It had crossed into something structural, legal, permanent. I called Claire Bennett just after 9. She had been my friend for more than 20 years, the kind who knew my history without needing reminders. We met when our children were still in school and stayed connected through career changes, losses, and the quiet reshaping that happens in your 50s. She answered on the second ring and asked if I was all right before I could say hello. I told her I needed to talk. I did not say why. She did not ask. She told me to come over. Claire lived in a modest house near the river, nothing flashy, nothing performative. When I walked in, she handed me a mug of coffee and sat across from me at her kitchen table. She listened without interrupting while I told her everything. Emily, the trust, Susan, Michael, the slow narrowing of my space. When I finished, Claire leaned back and exhaled slowly. She said she had seen this happen before. She said it always started politely. She said the mistake most women made was assuming it would stop on its own. Then she asked where she should put her things. I asked her what she thought I should do. She did not answer right away. Instead, she asked if I had spoken to a lawyer. I told her not yet. I said I was afraid of escalating things. Claire shook her head gently. She said knowing your position was not escalation, it was preparation. She asked if I trusted the paperwork Richard had handled over the years. I did not answer. That was answer enough. Claire gave me a name, Diane Whitaker, a family and estate attorney she knew through a volunteer board years ago. She said Diane was sharp and cautious and not easily impressed. She said if anyone would give me the truth without sugarcoating it, it would be her. I hesitated. Calling a lawyer felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. Claire reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She said silence was also a choice. She said choosing not to look did not protect you from what you might find. I left her house an hour later with the number written on a scrap of paper and a knot in my stomach that felt like resolve. I was 62 years old, and I knew that feeling well. That quiet moment when your body understands the danger before your mind is ready to accept it. I told her the guest room was down the hall on the left. Diane Whitaker's office was downtown, all glass and neutral colors, the kind of place designed to make emotions feel out of place. I arrived early and sat in the waiting area, watching people pass by with folders tucked under their arms, faces set in practiced calm. When Diane called my name, she did not smile. She shook my hand firmly and led me into her office. She asked me to start from the beginning. I told the story again, more carefully this time. I described the trust, the language I remembered, the changes in the house, the pressure from family. I handed her the copies of the documents I had made. She read silently for a long time. I watched her face, trying to read what she was not saying. When she finally looked up, her expression was measured. She said I needed to understand something before we went any further. She said trust law was not about fairness. It was about interpretation. She said the language mattered, the timing mattered, and most of all, the narrative mattered. She said my lifetime right to reside was real, but not invincible. She said it could be challenged if framed as disruptive to the household or contrary to the best interest of the family. I felt my chest tighten. I asked her if I could be forced to leave. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She nodded and stood, dragging her suitcase past me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral, too young for this house, too new. She said it depended on how this unfolded. She said if I acted impulsively, if I allowed myself to be portrayed as unreasonable or obstructive, I could weaken my position. She said if the trustee argued that conflict necessitated change, that argument could gain traction. I asked her what she would do if she were me. She said she would slow everything down. She said she would gather evidence of how decisions were being made without my consent. She said she would document behavior, not emotions. She said she would be strategic about timing. She also said something that stayed with me. She said this would not be quick or comfortable, and she said there was a real risk involved. I asked her if she would take my case. She paused. She said she would, but only if I understood that there were no guarantees. She said this was not about winning an argument. It was about preserving leverage long enough to force a fair outcome. I signed the engagement letter with a hand that trembled only slightly. As she disappeared down the hallway, I became painfully aware of how small I felt standing there among my own furniture, my own walls, my own life rearranged without my consent. When I left Diane's office, the city felt louder than usual. Cars honked. People brushed past me. Life continued as if nothing in my world had shifted. On the drive home, I replayed her words over and over. Narrative mattered. Timing mattered. Control mattered. When I pulled into the driveway, Emily's car was already there. I sat in my own vehicle for a moment longer than necessary, watching the front door, steadying myself. Inside, Emily was on the phone, pacing the living room. She lowered her voice when she saw me and smiled when she hung up. She asked how my day had been. I told her it had been informative. She laughed lightly and said that sounded serious. I did not respond. That evening, Richard noticed my distance. He asked if something had changed. He said I seemed different. I told him I had spoken to someone. Richard stepped closer. He said thank you quietly. He said he knew this was a lot. He said we would talk later. He asked who. I said a lawyer. The room went very still. He asked why. I told him I needed clarity. He said that was unnecessary. He said we could handle this privately. He said involving lawyers would only make things worse. I told him things were already worse. I told him I was no longer comfortable not knowing where I stood. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not with affection, with assessment. He asked if I was planning to fight him. I told him I was planning to protect myself. Later, the word people use when they want to postpone accountability. Emily stood in the doorway listening, her face unreadable. I wondered how much she understood. I wondered how much she had already planned for. Later that night, I sat in the office again, reviewing notes Diane had given me, lists of things to document, dates, conversations, changes in routine. I felt oddly calm as I wrote them down. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about ground, about who had the right to stand where. I did not know yet how this would end. I only knew that doing nothing was no longer an option, and that pretending this was temporary would cost me everything. As I turned off the light and headed upstairs, I heard Emily's door close softly down the hall. The house settled into silence once more, but this time it felt different, not heavier, sharper. I had crossed a threshold and there was no going back. Crossing that threshold changed how I moved through the house. I did not announce anything. I did not confront Emily or Richard again. Instead, I watched. I listened. I paid attention in a way I never had before, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. The house became a map of small signals. I noticed which rooms Emily used most: the living room in the late afternoon, the kitchen in the mornings. The guest room door stayed open more often now, her belongings spreading slowly beyond its boundaries. Shoes appeared by the front door that were not mine. A coat hung on the hook I used every winter. I nodded. I told him we would. None of it dramatic, all of it cumulative. I started keeping notes the way Diane suggested. Dates, times, words, not interpretations, just facts. Emily invited 2 friends over on Thursday without asking. Richard gave her the garage coat on Saturday. Susan referred to Emily as living here when she called on Sunday. I wrote it all down in a plain notebook I kept hidden in my bag. At first it felt petty, almost embarrassing, like I was stooping to something small. But the more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. This was not settling in. This was establishing presence. Emily behaved like someone who believed she would not be challenged. She spoke freely on the phone about plans weeks out. She asked Richard about repainting the guest room. She ordered small items online that arrived addressed to her at our house. Our house. Richard never objected. He did not stop her. He did not correct her language. When I brought up one of the deliveries, he said it was harmless. He said I was focusing on details instead of the bigger picture. I asked him what the bigger picture was. He said peace. That word again. Peace always seemed to require my silence. Susan finally spoke. She said this was for the best. She said families evolve. She said sometimes you have to make room for new energy. Helen Moore entered the picture quietly. Diane suggested I speak with her after I mentioned my concern that Richard might be preparing something behind my back. Helen was a private investigator, not dramatic or aggressive. She did not wear trench coats or speak in riddles. She was practical and direct, with a voice that suggested she had heard every version of this story before. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. She ordered black coffee and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few precise questions. Had Richard changed any financial accounts recently? Had I noticed new mail? Had Emily updated her address anywhere? I told her what I knew. Helen said she would look quietly. Nothing invasive, just verification. She said information was most powerful when it was boring and accurate. A week later, she called me from her car. She said Emily had updated her mailing address with her employer. She said she had listed our house as her residence. She said that suggested intent. Intent mattered. That night, Emily mentioned casually that she might have some furniture delivered soon. Just a small dresser, she said. She did not have room for everything in storage. I told her the guest room was already furnished. She smiled and said she knew, but it would feel more like home with her own things. More like home. The phrase had lost all innocence. I looked at her then, really looked, at the woman who had watched me care for her son for nearly 3 decades, who had eaten at my table every holiday, who now avoided my eyes while suggesting I shrink myself for the sake of peace. Richard watched the exchange and said nothing. I went upstairs afterward and sat on the edge of the bed, my notebook open beside me. I wrote down the date and what she had said. I felt strange doing it, like I was preparing for something I still did not want to admit was inevitable. The tension in the house shifted after that, not louder, sharper. Emily became more careful around me, but also more deliberate. She asked permission less often, not more. She began referring to shared spaces as ours. She told Susan on the phone that she was settling in nicely. She mentioned to a neighbor that she lived here now. The neighbor later asked me how long Emily had been my niece. That was the moment something inside me went very still. I corrected her gently. I said Emily was staying temporarily. The neighbor looked confused and said she thought it was more permanent, the way Emily talked about it. I went inside and closed the door. That evening, Richard told me Emily had had a hard day. He asked if I could be patient. He said the situation was fragile and that pushing back might cause damage that could not be undone. Michael excused himself and left shortly after. The front door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded final. Susan followed a few minutes later, saying she would give us space. I asked him what damage he meant. He said relationships. I asked him if he meant mine. He did not answer. Helen called again the next morning. She said Richard had contacted a lawyer 2 weeks earlier. She said the consultation appeared to be about trust administration. She said the timing aligned with Emily's move. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking slightly. This was no longer theoretical. Richard was not waiting to see how things went. He was preparing. I did not confront him right away. Diane had been clear. Reaction without strategy would only help him. Instead, I watched more closely. I noticed Richard taking calls in the garage. I noticed emails printed and placed carefully in his briefcase. I noticed Emily becoming more confident, more rooted. And just like that, the house emptied. She was not worried. That told me everything. One afternoon, I came home to find Emily measuring the wall in the guest room. She said she was thinking about art placement. I asked her how long she planned to stay. She paused, tape measure in hand, then said she had not really thought about it in terms of time. She said she was just trying to feel settled. I told her settling implied staying. She smiled and said sometimes things just worked out that way. That night I barely slept, not from fear, but from focus. In the early hours of the morning, I went back to the office and pulled out the trust documents again. I read them with Helen's information in mind, with Diane's warnings echoing in my head. I understood now what I needed to do and what I could not afford to do. I could not explode. I could not accuse. I could not frame this as emotional betrayal. Richard stood near the dining table, one hand resting casually on the back of a chair, as if this were any other family gathering. He looked calm, almost relieved. The kind of calm that comes when someone finally decides to say the thing they have been rehearsing for weeks. My mother-in-law, Susan, sat stiffly by the window, her lips pressed together, eyes darting between Richard and me. My stepson Michael leaned against the wall, scrolling on his phone, pretending not to notice the tension thick enough to taste. Richard went into the kitchen. I heard the cabinet open, the clink of a glass. He poured himself a drink even though it was barely 4 p.m. I needed to make this about process, about boundaries, about authority. Richard wanted to quietly normalize Emily's presence until it became unchallenged fact. Susan and Michael wanted me to step aside in the name of peace. Emily wanted permanence without confrontation. They all underestimated one thing. I had time and I had patience. The next evening, Richard announced we should all sit down together soon and talk things through. He said clarity would help everyone feel better. I agreed. Emily looked relieved. I felt something else entirely, because by then, I knew exactly what I would ask and when. I knew which questions would expose what had been assumed rather than agreed upon. I knew how to keep my voice calm while shifting the ground beneath them. The house was no longer just a place where things happened to me. I stayed where I was, standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by objects that held my memories. The framed photo of Richard and me on our 25th anniversary, the rug I had chosen after weeks of debate, the lamp my sister gave me before she passed. It had become a stage, and soon. Everyone would be forced to acknowledge who actually had the right to stand there. We gathered around the dining table the following evening, the same table that had held birthdays and holidays and ordinary dinners that once felt permanent. Richard suggested it. He said it would help to talk things through. He said clarity would ease tension. He said he wanted everyone to feel heard. Emily arrived first and took the chair closest to him. Susan came next, folding herself into a seat with the air of someone prepared to mediate. Michael joined by phone, his voice echoing faintly from the speaker placed in the center of the table. I sat last, choosing the chair I had always used, placing my hands flat on the wood to steady myself. The room smelled like roasted chicken and herbs, comfort food, neutral ground. Richard had always believed a meal softened hard conversations. He started by saying he appreciated everyone being willing to sit down together. He said change was hard. He said emotions ran high. He said his goal was for us to coexist peacefully. Susan nodded. Emily smiled. Michael murmured agreement from the phone. I waited. Richard turned to Emily and asked her to explain how she had been feeling. He said it was important we understood her perspective. Emily spoke calmly. She said she was grateful for the opportunity to stay here. She said she had not intended to cause friction. She said she felt welcomed at first and hoped that feeling could continue. She said stability mattered to her. I thought about how carefully I had built this life, how deliberately, how every inch of this house reflected years of decisions made together, compromises reached, sacrifices absorbed quietly. Stability, another careful word. Susan added that transitions took time. She said it was normal for people to feel uncomfortable at first. She said compassion would go a long way. Michael said everyone deserved a fresh start. He said holding on to the past too tightly only led to resentment. When they finished, all eyes turned to me. Richard asked how I felt. I took a breath, not a deep one, just enough. I said I felt displaced. I said the house no longer felt like my own. I said decisions were being made that affected my daily life without my consent. Susan interjected gently. She said no one meant to exclude me. I nodded and said intent was not the same as outcome. Richard shifted in his seat. He said we were a family, and he said families shared space. And now there was a stranger unpacking her suitcase down the hall. I asked him what he meant by family. He looked surprised by the question. He said the people who supported each other. I asked if that definition required agreement or simply accommodation. Silence settled over the table. I said I wanted to ask a few practical questions. I said this was not about feelings, but about structure. Richard frowned slightly, but said, go ahead. I asked how long Emily planned to stay. Emily hesitated. She said she had not set a timeline. She said she was taking things day by day. I nodded and asked Richard if that matched his understanding. He said yes. I walked slowly toward the armchair she had taken earlier. My chair. I ran my fingers along the armrest, feeling the worn fabric beneath my hand. It still felt like mine. For now. I asked if there had been any discussion about formalizing her stay. Richard asked what I meant. I asked if any paperwork had been reviewed, any agreements considered, any decisions made regarding residency. Susan shifted uncomfortably. Richard said that felt premature. He said we were just trying to get through the immediate situation. I said immediate situations became permanent ones when no boundaries were set. Emily spoke then. She said she did not want to be treated like a problem. She said she was just trying to build a life. I said I understood. I said building a life required clarity. I asked Richard who had authority to decide who lived in this house. He looked at me, irritation flickering across his face. He said that was a complicated question. From down the hall I could hear drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding along the closet rod, the sounds of someone settling in. I said complicated questions required careful answers. Michael's voice came through the speaker. He said this was getting too legal. He said it did not need to be. I said legality existed whether we acknowledged it or not. Susan sighed and said she wished we could stop turning everything into an argument. I said I was not arguing, I was asking. Richard finally said he was the trustee of the family trust and that decisions regarding the house fell under his purview. The words landed exactly as I expected them to. I asked if he believed that meant he could invite someone to live here indefinitely without my agreement. He said he believed it meant he could act in the best interest of the family. I asked if that included my best interest. The house was learning a new rhythm, and I had not agreed to it. He did not answer right away. Emily looked between us, her expression tightening. I asked if any steps had been taken to consult a lawyer regarding trust administration. Richard's jaw clenched. He said that was private. I said we were discussing shared space. I said nothing about this was private. Susan said she did not like where this was going. I said neither did I. I asked one final question, the one I had saved. I asked Richard if he would be willing to put in writing that Emily's stay was temporary and subject to my consent. The room went very quiet. Richard came back into the room and asked if I was okay. His voice carried that careful tone people use when they are afraid of triggering something. I told him I was fine, that I just needed a moment. Emily's face flushed. Susan looked at Richard sharply. Michael stopped speaking altogether. Richard said that was unnecessary. I asked why. He said it would make things adversarial. I said uncertainty already had. Emily said she felt attacked. I said boundaries were not attacks. Richard stood then, pushing his chair back slightly. He said this conversation was becoming unproductive. He said we needed to calm down and revisit it later. I said I agreed that we should revisit it. I said next time it would be with counsel present. That stopped him. He nodded again and retreated upstairs. He asked what I meant. I said I meant I would not continue discussions about my home without understanding my legal position. I said clarity was not a threat. It was protection. Susan said I was escalating. I said escalation had already happened. I said I was responding. Emily said she did not feel comfortable staying in a place where she was unwelcome. I said comfort and entitlement were not the same thing. Richard told me that tone was unnecessary. I told him I had been unnecessary for weeks and had stayed quiet anyway. The call with Michael ended abruptly. Susan stood and said she needed air. Emily excused herself and went down the hall, her steps quick and tight. Richard and I were left alone at the table. Alone at last. I sank into the chair. My chair. I sat there and let the weight of what had just happened settle fully into my body. He said he never thought it would come to this. I said neither had I. He said involving lawyers would damage things beyond repair. I said damage had already been done. He asked if I was trying to force him to choose. I said I was asking him to respect me. He did not respond. Later that night, after everyone retreated to separate corners of the house, I sat alone in the living room. The familiar quiet returned, but it no longer soothed me. The line had been drawn, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with questions that refused to be brushed aside. I had not issued an ultimatum. I had not made demands. And then there was Emily. This was not about love or jealousy or betrayal in the way people like to imagine it. I had done something far more destabilizing. I had asked for accountability. Upstairs, a door closed softly. Another opened. Footsteps crossed the hall and disappeared again. I stayed where I was, hands resting on the arms of my chair, feeling the house hold its breath. The next move would not be made at this table. It would be made on paper. Paper moved faster than people. The morning after that dinner, Diane called before 9. She said Richard's attorney had reached out to hers late the night before. She said the tone was cautious, not aggressive. She said that usually meant someone was realizing they had miscalculated. We met at her office that afternoon. I brought my notebook, the copies of the trust documents, and a calm I did not entirely feel but had learned to carry convincingly. Diane reviewed everything again, then slid a single page toward me. It was a formal notice asserting my lifetime right of residence and requesting immediate clarification of any attempt to alter occupancy without my consent. She explained it plainly. This was not an attack. It was a boundary. It forced a response. It put timing back on my side. I signed my name slowly. This was about territory. When I got home, Emily's car was gone. Richard's was still in the driveway. Inside, the house felt suspended, as if it were waiting for instructions. Richard was in the kitchen, standing by the counter with his phone in his hand. He looked up when I entered, eyes searching my face for something he could still control. He said Diane had contacted his lawyer. I said that was the point. He asked why I could not have talked to him first. I said I had tried. He said this made things official. I said things had been official the moment someone else unpacked into my life. He asked what I wanted. I said clarity about whether a woman my age was still allowed to occupy space without apologizing for it, about whether decades of shared history could be erased by a single confident smile and a suitcase on wheels. He asked what that meant. I said it meant Emily could not live here without my agreement. I said it meant decisions about the house could not be made unilaterally. I said it meant acknowledging that I had rights that did not disappear because things were inconvenient. He said his lawyer believed he had discretion as trustee. I said my lawyer believed discretion did not erase obligation. We stood there for a long moment, the kitchen quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I could see the calculation working behind his eyes. He was weighing outcomes, costs, optics. Emily returned that evening earlier than usual. She stopped short when she sensed the shift. Richard told her we needed to talk. They sat across from me in the living room, not touching, not close, like two people suddenly aware they were being observed. Richard explained that there were legal considerations now. He said things needed to slow down. He said no one was accusing anyone of wrongdoing. Emily asked if this meant she had to leave. The question hung in the air. I did not know yet what I would do. I did not have a plan forming neatly in my mind. All I had was a quiet certainty that something had shifted and that if I did nothing, I would slowly disappear inside the walls I had helped build. I said it meant the house was not available to her in the way she had assumed. She looked at Richard. He did not meet her eyes. She said she had been told this was temporary at first, but that plans had changed. She said she had updated her address. She said she had started building a life here. I said assumptions were not agreements. She said she felt blindsided. I said so had I. Richard tried to soften it. He said this was about process, not rejection. He said Emily could stay elsewhere while things were resolved. Emily stood then, anger flashing through her composure. She said she was not going to be treated like a mistake. I said no one had called her that. Down the hall, a door closed softly. She said she felt unwelcome. I said boundaries often felt that way when they arrived late. She turned to Richard and asked what he was going to do. He hesitated. That hesitation decided everything. The next morning, a small moving truck pulled up outside. Emily packed quietly. No drama. No raised voices. Just the steady sound of boxes being taped shut and carried out the front door. Susan did not come by. Michael did not call. The house watched as if it had seen this before. Emily paused at the doorway before she left. She looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for something she could still take with her. She said she thought things would turn out differently. I said most people did. Emily had finished unpacking. She nodded once and walked away. The truck drove off. The street returned to its usual stillness. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, breathing in the familiar air, letting the quiet settle back into its proper shape. Richard did not speak much that day. He moved through the house carefully, as if uncertain where he was allowed to step. That evening he asked if we could talk again. I said not tonight. He accepted that with surprising ease. Over the next few days, the formalities unfolded. Emails between lawyers, clarifications, written acknowledgments. Emily's address officially changed elsewhere. The trust remained intact. My right of residence reaffirmed. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just the slow return of ground beneath my feet. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me while I was getting the mail. She said she was sorry things had been awkward. She said she had not realized there was confusion. She said she was glad it was sorted out. I thanked her and went inside. I sat very still, listening to the house breathe around me, and understood with perfect clarity that this was only the beginning. I stayed in that chair long after the house fell quiet, letting the silence stretch until it stopped feeling sharp and started feeling familiar. That night, I sat in my chair by the fireplace and noticed how quiet the house felt again. Not empty, restored. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me. He said he never intended for things to go this far. I said intention was not the same as responsibility. He said he felt like he had lost something. I said so had I. We sat with that for a while, Later, alone in the office, I placed my notebook back into the filing cabinet. I did not feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The kind of grounded that comes from knowing where you stand and that no one can quietly move you without your consent. The house had answered the question everyone had avoided. It answered not with noise or spectacle, but with fact. There was a time when silence in this house meant peace. Early mornings before Richard woke up, late evenings after guests left, moments when the only sounds were the tick of the clock in the hallway and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Silence used to mean safety. I turned off the light and closed the door gently. Upstairs. Richard moved around in the bedroom. Downstairs. The familiar creak of the floor greeted me as I walked back into the living room. The pause had arrived. Everything after this would be different. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but settled in a way that felt earned. Emily did not return. Her presence faded quickly, as if the house itself had decided she had never belonged. The guest room door stayed closed. The extra shoes disappeared. The air shifted back to something familiar. I moved through the room slowly, reclaiming small rituals without announcing them. My mug returned to its hook. My chair stayed by the fireplace. The bookshelf remained exactly as I liked it. Richard tried to act normal. He made coffee in the mornings. He asked if I wanted anything from the store. He spoke carefully, like someone testing ice after a crack. I did not push him away, but I did not close the distance either. That space was necessary for both of us. Susan did not call for a while. When she finally did, her voice was clipped, polite. She asked how I was. She said she hoped everything was settled. She did not apologize. I did not ask her to. Some realizations arrive quietly and do not require speeches. Michael sent a brief message saying he hoped things were better now. I replied that they were clearer. That felt more honest. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants on the porch, a neighbor waved from across the street. She smiled, a little sheepish, and said it was nice to see me out there again. I realized then how visible my absence had been, even when I was still physically present, how people noticed when a woman slowly receded. That night, I sat in the living room with a book I had been meaning to read for years. The fire crackled softly. The house breathed around me for the first time in weeks. I did not feel like I was waiting for the next disruption. That night it felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. Richard joined me later, standing near the doorway. He asked if I wanted company. I said he could sit if he wanted. He chose the opposite end of the sofa, not crowding the space between us. He said he had been thinking a lot. He said he never meant to make me feel disposable. He said he underestimated how much he had taken for granted. I listened without interrupting, not because I was forgiving him, but because I was done needing him to understand everything all at once. He asked if I was angry. I thought about it. About the weeks of pressure, the quiet fear, the realization that my security could be negotiated without my consent. I told him I was not angry. I told him I was changed. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Over the next month, life found a new rhythm, not the old one. Something adjusted. I met Claire for walks by the river. I kept my appointments with Diane until everything was fully documented and finalized. I returned Helen's last call to thank her and told her I hoped I would not need her services again. One evening, I opened the old photo album Richard and I had kept on the bookshelf. I flipped through pages of younger faces, vacations, milestones. I did not feel sadness so much as distance. The woman in those pictures had believed stability was something you earned once and then owned forever. I knew better now. I got up and walked slowly through the living room, touching things as I passed. the edge of the bookshelf where I had once sanded down a rough corner myself, the picture frame that still held a photo of us from years ago, standing in front of this same house after the renovation was finished, both of us smiling like we believed we had arrived somewhere permanent. The house itself began to feel different, not because anything physical had changed, but because I no longer moved through it cautiously. I rearranged a few pieces of furniture. I painted the guest room a softer color and turned it into a reading space. I donated items that no longer felt like mine. One afternoon, standing in that room with sunlight spilling across the floor, I realized something important. This was not revenge. I had not won by taking something from someone else. I had won by refusing to be moved quietly out of my own life. People like to talk about strength as if it were loud or dramatic, as if it required confrontation and spectacle. What I learned was that strength at my age looked different. It looked like asking the right questions at the right time. It looked like knowing when silence protected you and when it erased you. Richard and I did not suddenly become close again. We were civil. We were careful. We were honest in ways we had not been before. Whether that would be enough in the long run, I did not yet know. And for the first time, I understood that not knowing did not mean I was powerless. One evening, I stood at the front window watching the street settle into dusk. Porch lights flickered on. A couple walked their dog. Life continued, indifferent and steady. I thought about how close I had come to being quietly pushed aside, how easily it could have happened if I had chosen comfort over clarity. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening to this story, it is this: do not wait until you feel safe to ask questions. Ask them because you deserve to know where you stand. Your age does not make you smaller. Your history does not make you expendable. And your silence does not buy you peace if it costs you yourself. She stood beside Richard with a small rolling suitcase at her feet. Her hand resting lightly on the handle, she wore jeans and a cream sweater. Hair neatly styled, makeup just enough to look effortless. She did not look nervous. She looked prepared, as if she had already imagined herself in this room, already pictured where she would put her things, already decided where she belonged. We bought this place in 2008. I remember the exact month because the economy was wobbling and everyone told us it was a terrible idea. Houses were sitting on the market. Friends warned us to wait, to rent something smaller, to be careful at our age. I turned away from the window and walked back into the living room, my living room, and sat down in my chair. The floor creaked beneath me in that familiar way, like an old friend acknowledging my return. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt yourself being edged out of a space you earned, I hope you will share your thoughts. Stay here with me for more stories like this, stories about holding ground, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself when it matters most. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "This is where I stand." I was 46 then. Richard was 50. We stood in the empty living room on a rainy afternoon while the realtor talked numbers and potential. The house smelled like dust and old paint. The floors were scuffed. The kitchen was outdated. Most people saw problems. I saw possibility. I saw the way the light came in through the front windows. I saw where I would put my chair by the fireplace. I saw holidays, quiet mornings, a place to grow old without having to explain myself. We used my savings for the down payment, money I had set aside from years of careful budgeting and consulting work. Richard handled the paperwork. He always did. He was good with numbers too, or at least good at making them sound simple. I trusted him. There was no reason not to. We renovated slowly, over years. Every change felt earned. I picked the paint colors. I chose the fixtures. I argued for the wider doorway and the extra lighting, even when Richard said it was unnecessary. I told him someday we would appreciate it. We did. This house held every version of me I had been since my 40s. The woman still working full-time, balancing clients and family. The woman easing into semi-retirement, taking fewer projects, learning how to enjoy unstructured days. The woman who lost her sister and spent months moving through these rooms like a ghost, leaning on the familiarity of the walls to stay upright. People like to say a house is just a house. 4 walls and a roof. That is easy to say when you have never had to rebuild yourself inside one. I walked down the hallway, past the guest room door that was now closed. I did not knock. I did not listen. I did not want to hear proof of her presence more than I already had. Richard cleared his throat. Instead, I went into the kitchen. The kitchen had always been my domain, not because Richard demanded it, because I wanted it. I liked knowing where everything was. I liked the rhythm of cooking, the control of it. I ran my hand along the counter, noticing a small stack of mail pushed slightly out of place. Emily had already been here, already shifted something, even if it was unintentional. I opened a cabinet and saw a mug turned the wrong way, handle facing inward instead of out. It was a small thing, ridiculous to notice, and yet it made my chest tighten. This was how it started, not with screaming or slammed doors, but with subtle erasures. Richard came downstairs eventually. He said he thought I'd gone to bed. He asked if I wanted tea. I told him no. I asked him how long she was planning to stay. He hesitated, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. He said it depended. He said things were complicated. He said he did not want to rush anything. He said we all needed time to adjust. I asked him adjust to what exactly. He sighed and rubbed his temples, the way he did when he wanted to end a conversation without actually answering it. He said life changed. He said people changed. He said this was not meant to hurt me. I told him intent did not matter nearly as much as impact. He said he wanted everyone to hear this together. He said it was easier that way. He said Emily was going to be staying with us for a while. He said family takes care of family. He said we should all try to make her feel welcome. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something like doubt cross his face. But it passed quickly. He told me we would talk more tomorrow. Tomorrow again, always tomorrow. He went upstairs. I stayed behind. I slept in my own bed that night, but did not rest. I lay awake listening to the house adjust to its new inhabitant, a door opening softly, footsteps, water running in the bathroom down the hall. Each sound landed like a reminder that something fundamental had shifted. In the morning, I made coffee the way I always had. Same mug, same routine. Emily came into the kitchen wearing a robe that was not hers, mine. I recognized the fabric immediately. She apologized lightly, said she had grabbed the wrong one, said she hoped I did not mind. I told her it was fine. The lie tasted bitter. She asked where we kept the extra towels. She asked if I preferred oat milk or almond. She asked if the neighbors were friendly. Each question assumed permanence, assumed inclusion, assumed consent. Richard kissed my cheek before leaving for work, as if nothing about this was unusual, as if I were simply hosting a guest and not watching my life rearranged in real time. I waited for the word that never came, temporary, short-term. Until things settle, none of that appeared. After they left the room together, talking quietly, I stood alone at the sink, staring out the window. I watched the trees sway gently in the yard we had landscaped ourselves. I watched a bird land on the fence and tilt its head, as if curious about the silence inside. I realized then that this was not about jealousy or competition or fear of being replaced in the way people like to frame these stories. This was about belonging, about whether a woman in her 60s still had the right to occupy space without being asked to shrink, about whether decades of partnership could be rewritten without her agreement. I had built a life around the assumption that what we created together was stable, that it would not simply be handed to someone else with a smile in a suitcase. Standing there, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, clearer. A question. What exactly gave him the right to decide who lived here? I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel neatly, and placed it back where it belonged. I glanced down the hallway one more time, at the closed door that now separated me from a stranger unpacking into my life. I did not know the answer yet, but I knew where to start looking.